All right. Having trouble connecting, check your internet connection. Let me try again. Good morning. Welcome to Wednesdays with Willa. I am your host, Willa White, and this is my weekly podcast show that airs on Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern on my Facebook page, Willa White Medium. It also goes out on the Lilydale Assembly Facebook page and is uploaded to my YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch it on all of those platforms. It's a weekly show that focuses on topics relating to spiritualism, mediumship, healing, faith, family, and more. And it's always a wonderful delight to have guests on the show. This is actually year 8 of Wednesdays with Willa. So there are many, many, many archive videos of past shows that you can enjoy to your heart's content, of lovely guests, great topics. And I encourage you to look back at those. And in fact, I'll be mentioning one in particular in just a little bit, but I want us to get on into our topic, which will be Mavis Pittilla, Behind the Medium. And to be able to do that, I've asked a very special guest here today, Jean Else. Thanks for being here today, Jean.
My pleasure. Absolutely pleasure.
And for those of you who don't know who Jean Else is, you haven't been paying attention, because she is definitely an incredible force and helper behind the world-renowned United Kingdom medium Mavis Pittilla. Serving as her spouse and work partner for 24 years, Jean Else has really had the behind-the-scenes understanding of Mavis and assisted her in an amazing supportive role in Mavis's mediumship business. And she's here today to share stories about Mavis's mediumship and personal life. And she's definitely carrying on the legacy of Mavis Pittilla's work and teaching of mediums, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the show. But this will be a very special and lovely look into the world of Mavis Pittilla, spiritual medium, tutor at Arthur Findlay Spiritualist College for many years, and mentor to many of the world's mediums. So thank you for being here today, Jean, to talk about Mavis, near and dear to our hearts.
Thank you. It's my absolute joy, because I like to keep my lady alive, as she still is, in another form maybe, but she's still well and truly alive. So
yes, indeed. And there have been instances where, myself and others, we felt Mavis around us. She's still definitely helping spiritualism and helping mediumship and growing things in beautiful ways. She is a light upon the earth still.
Absolutely. And she always vowed she'd never stop teaching. And, I've got so much evidence that she still is, which is wonderful. To know that she's carrying on doing something that made her so joyful and passionate is wonderful to know.
Indeed. And, as I mentioned in the introduction for this, Mavis is the mentor to many of the world's mediums. And that was with good reason, because she really fostered that understanding of the soul's divine connection with the spirit world and how to bring that in such a beautiful, humbling, trusting way. And I think it'll be great for them to have the whole story of Mavis Pittilla. And certainly, before we go any further, I guess I should mention, there's a wonderful book that was written about Mavis Pittilla by Suzanne Giesemann, who is an author of many, many books, but this one is Droplets of God. And this is all about Mavis. So if you want more Mavis, this is a great way in book form to know a bit more about her life and her philosophies. And it's a really well-written book indeed. And I felt so fortunate to have Mavis on the show a few times, to share her wisdom with us in beautiful ways, and to have met her here in Lilydale.
She loved it. She loved speaking to you, and she loved Lilydale. And I'm delighted that Lilydale have honoured her with her portrait being in the assembly rooms. And that, I know, would be an absolute thrill for Mavis. Will be a thrill, because I'm sure she's aware of it. So, yeah.
It's nice to see her smiling face on the wall whenever I go in the assembly hall here in Lilydale.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she's definitely a special person. And what I think is so interesting, we'll start with Mavis. Mavis was born.
Mavis
Mavis
was
was
born
born.
in Middleton, which is it was a cotton mill town in Lancashire, which is northern England, hence my accent as well. And she, in her first book, which was called Mavis with Spirit, if we're doing a bit of advertising, Willa, she talks about herself being a Middleton moonraker, which is she was born within the bells of the main church in Middleton. I'm not quite sure what that means, but she was very proud of that. She loved Middleton. She loved the area she lived in, and that's where everything started ultimately. So, it. She moved away from there. First of all, when she got married when she was 20, and moved to Australia with her husband then, and did only lasted the 2 years. She went out on what was called a £10 ticket, which they were encouraging skilled people to go out and work in Australia in those days. But she was so homesick that she came back after 2 years, unfortunately leaving her husband in Australia, but she came back with her son and moved back to Middleton, where she remained really for quite a number of years until eventually she moved over to where we lived together in Macclesfield, which is where I was, which is probably about 30 miles away, that's all, but more south than north, really. But within Middleton, she was she hated school. Um, she was a war baby. Her father went off to war as she was born, and he didn't need to go off to war because he was in a protected industry.
Right.
And so she had a very close relationship just with her mum because her two elder sisters had left home by then. So she was kind of cosseted by mum, and they had a beautiful relationship. And so she never really knew her dad. And then when he did come home from war, he'd been very badly injured in Dunkirk. So she only knew him as a very disabled father. And she resented him to a certain degree because he took mum away from her. So she had a strange relationship with him. And yet, and again, nobody knows this, only me, at the end of her life, when she was in the hospice, her dad came to her and she shouted, "Dad." And I thought that's really odd. But I've had that confirmed from other mediums now that he did indeed come for her. So I assume they've established a relationship now. So that's lovely. It's lovely.
And kind of long overdue in many ways.
Yeah. It was always something, she understood why, I think she was about 9 when he died. So she understood why, and I think she was 5 or 6 when he came home. So she didn't have long with him anyway. And then he was very ill when he came home. So, but, at that time, you don't understand, do you? But so she continued to remain in Middleton. She was very a devout Christian, a High Church of England, which is almost akin to being a Catholic, and loved her religion right from the beginning. But so I suppose when she started connecting with spirit, which we'll talk about a little bit later, she already had an understanding of religion, but from a conventional view. And of course, being involved with the spirit world challenges that conventional view. So she had all that to tussle with. But in her young days, when she was working in the cotton mill, because she didn't have much of an education because of the war, and everybody at school used to say, "Oh, you're not as good as your sisters." So she always felt put down, and and that lasted her the rest of her life. That the way that teachers had treated her. Sadly, she married a teacher. So, but fortunately, I was able to kind of, encourage her and let her know that not all teachers were like that. I think it was just a generational thing. But she carried on trying her best and doing her best. And as you know, she was a very articulate and beautifully spoken and beautifully written wordsmith. ultimately. And so how sad that she was put down in those early days. So, but she actually took up a job in the cotton mill, which was the industry in the area where she lived at the time, and her mother was already in that industry. And she was only there. She was only there for about 18 months, 2 years, and yet she would still always describe herself as a cotton mill girl. And the reason was she had such camaraderie and there was such teamwork because they all looked out for one another. And and it was still a male-dominated business industry by the overseers and the people in charge. The women were the lackeys that did everything. So she loved the camaraderie, and she always maintains part and parcel of her ability to communicate with spirit came from there, though she didn't know why. But it was so noisy you couldn't speak to one another. So a lot of the time you were in your head. You were in your own thoughts.
Right.
And so she believes that actually was probably early training for when she became mediumistic, But she absolutely loved that. And but then from then on, she moved to Australia, as I said, hated it, had hallucinations, saw her mother at the end of these kind of, she was in Melbourne, but it wasn't the Melbourne we know now. It was a very kind of remote and, just really deserted area, and she hated it with a vengeance.
It sounds like such a lonely existence for her there.
Yeah.
And
but anyway, and again she came back home and eventually remarried, and then became very ill, sadly, and they gave her 3 months to live, and that's when the mediumistic version of Mavis Pittilla started. So I don't know where you want me to meander from there, because I can go in so many directions.
I know. I think that's a great nutshell of those beginning years for her. I think it'd be great to just step back a moment and say, well, when she was a child, one of her sisters was mediumistic and saw spirit and was kind of scared Mavis. Right?
Absolutely. And of course, Mavis didn't know what mediumistic was or seeing spirit at the time. She was about 6 years younger than her sister Joyce, who was, ultimately a medium. There's some funny stories to tell about that as well. But yeah, so for a period of time, they shared a bedroom, and Joyce would frighten her. There'd be they had a picture of Grace Darling on the wall. I don't know whether people know who Grace Darling was, but she went out to save sailors in a ship that was sinking off the coast, and she rowed a boat out with her dad to save these sailors. So she became very well known in folklore in England. And Joyce used to say, you can see the oars moving, and it used to frighten. Or she'd say somebody's coming out of the wardrobe, and Mavis literally was so frightened. And she always used to say she was at nervous breakdown stage, really, that Mother banned Joyce from ever talking about it. And Mother never really acknowledged that there was anything in it other than Joyce was making these things up. But in actual fact, Joyce was really seeing people. And one day she did actually look out of the window and said to her mum, Mrs. Suchabody's just wandered down the road. And her mum knew that lady had died the night before. So she said to Joyce, don't be so silly, And of course, Joyce said, well, why? And she said, well, she died last night. But Joyce had seen her walking down the street, So anyway, Joyce then moved away. She got married, and Mavis was then on her own to fend for herself. So she'd had these ghost stories, but they were ghost stories. She didn't understand them as mediumship until much later.
And so now I think that takes us into her experience. She's ill. She's starting to have spirit contact experience. And how about we just briefly explain a little bit about that first contact for her?
Yeah. Well, she became very ill and nobody knew what it was. And this is going back. She was around 27. I'm just trying to add up. So she was born in 39. So it would be like early 60s, something like that. And of course, they didn't have the technology we do now. And she was diagnosed with cancer and given only 3 months to live. And she just remarried. They just bought a house. Her son was about 7 by then. And being this Christian, she sat there one day in the home arguing with God and saying, why now? Why me? Feeling really sorry for herself. And then suddenly a guy, a normal, ordinary man, appeared right in front of her, and she was in the house on her own, and said, go find a healer or you won't hear the New Year bells. And of course she was and he disappeared, she said, as quickly as she saw him. But she was on a lot of medication. So when Terry, her husband, came home from work, he said, how have you been? And she told him. And he just thought she was losing the plot because of the medication. So anyway, the next day he goes into work and one of his friends said, and how's Mavis? So he told him. And this guy said, I'm a spiritual healer. And from then on, obviously the link was made. So this guy used to do spiritual healing with Mavis. She continued with the conventional medicine, but nothing was helping her. And she was very weak and very ill. And then again, a miracle happened one day. A student doctor decided as part of his thesis to carry out a very old test on Mavis's culture. And it turned out, he found out that it was TB and not cancer at all. So then they could start the right treatment. So it was just amazing what happened. And then after she'd seen this guy appear in the living room, and as she continued with the spiritual healing, she was seeing spirit all the time. And of course, she didn't know what it was and how to cut it off. But she'd say, oh, you can't sit there, my grandma's there. And grandma had been dead 20 years, or the cat's there and the cat had been dead, you know. But she said, actually, the spirit world became more interesting than the real world in the end. You know, she didn't know what was happening, but she quite liked it. And then she found out that she could tune into people. Obviously, psychic now we know, but she didn't know that. So she'd know if they did go out with people that, you know, who was having an affair with who, or what was going on with people. And she said she lost lots of friends because of that, but she didn't understand it. It was just so natural for her. And then eventually she did go along to the church that she belonged to and thought she had attracted evil spirits, because Middleton, where she lived, wasn't far from Pendle Hill. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Pendle Hill and the witches. Far more witches killed there than in Salem. And Mavis and I did visit Salem. So she was very competitive and said, oh, we had more witches killed in Pendle. And so she thought, because she lived in that witchcraft area, that she'd attracted an evil spirit. So she went along to the church and asked the local priest whether she could have an exorcism. And he said, well, I'll have to go and speak to the bishop. So he went off and she was sat in the church. And then Mika-san, I haven't told you how Mika-san arrived, have I yet? Right. But Mika-san, the guide, her guide, came and sat at the side of her, and he was a Chinese guy, and said to her, if I should harm a hair on your head or a blade of grass, walk away from me. But until then, walk with me. And they both got up and walked out of the church. And the relationship was cemented from then on. But the way that she found Mika-san, when she was going through this discovery of what the illness was, one night she was just sat at home with her husband, and she thought she'd fallen asleep. And because she was very weak. And then when she woke up, Terry was white. And she said, what on earth's the matter? He said, I've just been talking to a Chinese gentleman. And that she'd fallen into a natural trance, and Mika-san had come through. And he told Terry about they were going to change some of her tablets, and these tablets would help. And he described the colour and the sign, and it was absolutely true what happened. And from then on, Mika-san would appear, and he was so clear to her for many, many years that, you know, he would stand in the kitchen and talk to her, or And she used to have to say, "Excuse me, can I go in my fridge?" if she was making a cup of tea. And he was that real to her. It was fantastic. So they had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. So then after she'd walked out of the church, she decided that she really must go and find out what this was all about. So she went to the local spiritualist church and met her first teacher, Mr. Brooks, there. And he helped her understand what was going on. So moving on from there, Mr. Brooks was not a medium, actually. She absolutely adored this Mr. Brooks. He was the president of this little church, and it was a little church. It was just in a house, actually, this spiritualist church in Middleton where she lived. And he made her understand what spiritualism was and how she had to understand God and the spirit world. And she had to understand being of service. And though she could demonstrate mediumship because she could see, hear them, he wouldn't let her demonstrate at all until she'd learned how to serve the congregation teas and coffees, arrange the flowers, clean the toilets. She had to learn service first, and then he let her go. But in those days, she said she was, she got little mini skirts on and white boots and her hair all piled up. So she was very trendy. She was one of the young ones then. And
she was a teddy girl or something, right?
Well, she says a teddy girl, yeah. A bit between what we call a teddy girl and a mod, but very trendy in her time. And of course, like we do you're not as old as me, but you look at the youngsters now and think, what are they wearing? And why are they? And of course, Mavis had all that prejudice to manage. So sometimes they didn't like her going on the platform demonstrating.
Well, not in a mini skirt.
No, they actually, on some occasions, she said, used to put a cover over the rails because many of the churches in those days were in houses. So they just a little platform with a rail in front. So she said sometimes they used to put covers over because she was showing too much leg.
And even, if you're up on a platform, there's all that too.
Oh, and the stories that I could, I'd fill in the rest of your next 8 years talking about the stories she told me about, looking down from the platform and seeing a dead rat under somebody's chair, or a hair catching the ceiling and spiders' webs were up there, and so all sorts of funny stories. But
and Mr. Brooks was definitely a great mentor to her during that time.
Absolutely.
Kept her study. And when I was reading that in the book, I was thinking about, it's like maybe you don't know, Karate Kid with
I do.
Son of Mr. Miyagi.
That was one of her favorite films because of that.
Oh, yeah. Because he had to do all the work. It's like paint the fence. You have to do all of these other things that seem so mundane. But I think there's humbleness. That's part of that, and the working hard.
Yeah. And understanding that it's a service to both worlds.
Yes.
To the spirit. And it's not about ego, because that's the worst thing, isn't it? She admitted fully that, once she got out there on the scene and, Gordon Higginson, who was the president of the Spiritualist National Union, that some people might know, but probably one of the most one of the pioneers of the last century, really, but one of the most renowned and respected men, certainly in England, not traveling so much around the world in those days, but a fantastic medium. And he became a mentor. And of course, she was flying high, and she once said, and it's an expression that, again, the Americans won't know, but that her head became as big as Birkenhead, which is a town near Liverpool. But so, because she said, everybody was praising her, so she said she struggled to get through the door because of this. But she said, what I'm just trying to think, she had a lovely expression from a Catherine Cookson book. And you may not know Catherine Cookson, but she was a northeastern writer in England, and she always wrote about poverty at the turn of the century, and it was all waifs and strays. And Mavis loved reading her.
And those were turned into movies too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I bought Mavis the collection, and but Mavis's best quote from that, when her head became like this, Catherine Cookson used to say, "God's a blind miller, and he grinds us all exceedingly small, so we become good food for other people." And she lived with that, because she knew with this ego, you get slapped down eventually, and you always do, don't you? And she laughed about it. And of course, the major thing about Mavis beyond that was she was always very humble, as you say, about her mediumship, and the ego wasn't there at all. She just loved what she did, and she loved why she did it as well, which was, in her words, to be about her father's business.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
yeah.
And I think just to give some people context, when Mavis got slapped down, the big moment of slap down that she felt this with, she went to do a demonstration, and her objective clairvoyance was gone.
Everything.
And
So
she was like,
she used to get on the platform and say, because it was so easy for her, because she could see them physically, she could hear them, and she said, and she used to get on the platform and say, "Now I'm an objective medium. I see the spirit world clearly, just as I'm seeing you. I hear them just as I'm hearing you." And nothing was there. Nothing at all was there.
like worst case scenario for every medium.
Yeah. And then suddenly she started getting all these clairvoyant visions in her mind.
Yeah.
And then thought, what do I do with these? And had to work out what they were showing her.
On the spot.
Yeah. Fortunately, because she'd known other mediums that did that, she understood what was going on, but she'd never had to deal with it. So yes. So she was brought down to earth very, very swiftly, shall we say. But yeah.
And it made her doubt her mediumship ability for a while there.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
She withdrew, right? That she withdrew from doing anything for a while until she refocused with the Catherine Cookson quote.
Yeah, I think that withdrawal was partially that, but there were other kind of material things going on, that made us think and really need to be concentrating on the family as well, because her mediumship was taking her away totally from the family. But as she always says, you can't stay away from this because your soul pulls you back. And Gordon left her at peace for a little while. But she always felt guilty, kind of, deserting him in a sense. But eventually,
she had a husband and a child, and it is difficult. And a mother.
Their mother moved in with them. Yeah,
those things. And
absolutely. And she would always say now, and I said it for many years, really, in her training, because part of Mavis's training is about knowing yourself, and that everybody becomes so obsessed when they get involved with the development of mediumship that they can neglect their family and their friends, and this becomes the prime focus. And yet Mavis always says, remember that your material life, your family and your friends are also gifts from God. So don't neglect them at the expense of your mediumistic gifts or faculties, she used to like to call them. So she always said, get the balance, and honestly said she did not get that balance. So it kind of impacted both on her relationship and, and even the care of her mother, because she was wanted all over, not only at the college, but all over the country, in every church in those days that, she could serve, she went to do it. And so she always used to say, don't do as I do as I say with that. So really try and keep the balance. And that, and I think if you can get that advice early on, that's good.
It's a crucial element to all of this, because you really want to have that quality of life. And having
that's what we're here for, isn't it?
Work-family balance is really very, very important. I'm always advocating that for my students too. They recognize that sometimes mediumship does have to take a back burner while you deal with what's going on in your current mundane life.
Yeah.
is so crucial. And
I think Mavis's expression that your material life is a gift from God also is
truly,
key to understand that. No
yeah.
matter the ups and downs of it, are all part and parcel of why we're on this earthly journey as well.
Yes, I know I'm so grateful for my own family. It does keep me grounded so that I don't get into the woo-woo land as far as that goes. But do you mind if we just, before we move on, can we move into what it was like for her to be a mom and what that
Yeah.
for
I
her?
mean, she loved her. She obviously loved her son. Um, and again, had that kind of distressing beginning with him, really, because she was in Australia. So
Yeah.
she was more focused on trying to get home, really, than anything else. And then obviously she came back home. She did move in with her mother, I think, initially.
Do you think she had postpartum as well during
It
that
could
time?
possibly. I mean, obviously, we've never spoken about that, and she never acknowledged that. But it's quite possible. But the one thing I always used to say to her, because she loved her mother so much, they had such a beautiful relationship from those early days when her father was at war. How could you at 20 think about going all the way to Australia, which in those days, I mean, now you get on a plane and I know it's a long flight, but you get there and back fairly rapidly. But you had to go on a ship in those days and it would take 6 weeks to get there. And how did you ever dream of leaving your mother? And of course, the only answer was new man, new husband, fall in love, 20. But I don't know that I could have done it. And yet, really, on one level, I wasn't as close to my mother as Mavis was with her. So the conundrum, really. But when she came back, she moved in with her mum for a while, and then several years after, 3 or 4 years after, she met Terry, and then they got married. But mum moved in with them then, so she had, not only the husband but her mum and her son.
But
So I
she
think,
also had that childcare then at her
yeah, she
mother
did. Yeah, she
providing
did.
that for
Yeah.
her. That
Yeah,
multi-generational family
yeah,
unit,
yeah,
what really probably supported her so she could do her mediumship
yeah.
work.
Oh, undoubtedly. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And so did her mother and son develop a strong relationship through that
Yes, he
time?
did. Yeah, very much so. But he and her son joined the Navy at the age of 15. So he'd gone off to sea at 15,
Mhm.
which again seems incredibly young now, but it wasn't then. You
Right.
know, but everybody was starting their careers then. So then when he did settle, he settled at the south of the country where all the naval bases were. So, he was always then at a distance, physically at a distance,
Mhm.
for many years. And again, now the use of, you call them cell phones, we call them mobile phones, or even this media is so easy now, isn't it? But it wasn't in those days. You literally had to write letters still, or use a kind of static telephone. But so communication kind of, really only this last 30 years has changed so tremendously. So there was a distance in those early days, and
Physical and then also emotional, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
through that time.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
And I know initially her husband supported the mediumship in that sense of, hey, this is interesting. But then he didn't like that she was away so much, right? That caused the
yeah,
issue.
oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, he was very interested, and when in her early development days, of course, he went along to, seances with her, and they had some interesting experiences in there, and he used to even go down to the college on some occasions when she was there. But of course, he was having to keep his material life going and work, and a very nice man, and I knew him well, so I've nothing wrong to say about him. But it was on those days where your husband expected his dinner on the table when
Sure.
he came home. And of
Yes.
course, Mavis was never of that ilk anyway. But the fact that she was away so much. And again, nowadays you'd buy ready meals, wouldn't you? Leave them in the freezer for your husband. But you couldn't do that in those days. So it's just a different time and age. And I guess because as Mavis said, she focused so much on her mediumship, and she loved it. And she loved her teaching as well as her demonstrating and her private sittings. So, it just became the be all and end all. And of course, you know yourself, you kind of develop another community of friends and loved ones. Really, your friends become your relatives in a sense.
Yes, the spiritual family
Yes,
develops.
yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the nice thing about Mavis, and Mavis does a wonderful lecture on worlds within worlds, which was given to her by Mika-san,
Mm.
her guide. And again, that's another long story. But in these worlds within worlds, in your second world, your first world, she described as the mental world, which is where when we die, we go and we have that reunion with people that have gone over before us. And we learn how to use the power of thought rather than communicate, obviously, through speech, because we've shed this physical body. Then we move on to what she called the etheric world. And in the etheric world, we're allowed to do our own life review. So we're not judged by God or any higher being on what we've done in our lives. We actually look at our lives and judge ourselves, see where our mistakes have been made, and try and understand why sometimes mistakes we think we've made are actually things that have turned out very favorably and have turned out better for us than what we could have expected. But Mavis always throughout her life before she died tried to reconcile spiritually and soul wise with the things that she felt she had made mistakes with, and that was becoming obsessed with mediumship and neglecting certain other areas of her life. So she always felt before she died, she'd kind of reconciled that within her mind by admitting the mistakes. It's no good hiding away from them, but and then if in some way by helping others not do the same thing, she felt she was making amends. So I'm sure she has with many people.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Can we lean into her experiences with Gordon Higginson? Because he really did his best to buoy her up, and she did demonstrations with him, partnered with him, but he kept kind of nudging her. Hey, now you're going to teach. Now you're going to do this.
Oh, yeah.
That process of it, and each time she would have this opportunity given to her, she would kind of there's that bit of the seize up.
Well,
her, right?
and that all stems from what I said earlier, a terrible educational experience, and I think once you've been knocked like that, I'm hearing a refurb on my voice for some reason, but once you've been kind of dismissed and knocked down in that way as a child, that is awful to overcome, isn't it? So she'd first of all never believed she'd ever do anything in the public eye. She was this cotton mill girl. She then was from the north of England where, again, without education, she hadn't got a good vocabulary or anything like that. She wasn't really, although I say she wasn't a wordsmith, she loved the language of the Bible, and so she was really, but she didn't understand she was, and so when Gordon got his eye on her, and again, just a brief story. Again, she did all the northern churches, but she travelled up and down the country, and again, that's a whole book in itself of what she experienced in some of these churches in the early days, in the 60s and 70s. But she used to serve a church called Hyde Church, which is in Hyde in Cheshire, probably about an hour, 90 minutes away from where Mavis lived. And it was a very famous spiritualist church of its time. It was very forward thinking. And it was, strangely enough, run by a couple called Mr. and Mrs. Hyde. Even though the church was named after the area, that was their name also. And they were devoted to this church. And so Mavis used to serve them, but they were very friendly with Gordon because, of course, Gordon used to serve this prestigious church. And they told him about Mavis and how good she was. And they regretted it ever after. Because Gordon took her down to the college, away from the churches. And yes, and he did. He nudged her on. She said she learned more from Gordon driving up and down the country in his car, where they'd have deep philosophical conversations. But yes, he took her down to the college initially because she wasn't well still at that stage, and just for recuperation. But he knew he'd eventually draw her in to listening to some lectures, because in those days there were only lectures. They didn't have workshops. But of course she did eventually go and sit in, and then eventually he got her up to demonstrate, and then eventually he got her to demonstrate before scientists who'd come down from the Edinburgh School of Parapsychology, where they were trying to prove the link between mediumship and science. And then he got her into speaking, and she actually went for not elocution lessons, but speech development lessons in order to enhance her ability to speak publicly. And for a little while, she became very, very, Queen's English like this for a while. But then she settled back into being normal. But nevertheless, as you know, she was one of the most beautiful, inspirational and spiritual speakers. I never tired listening to her. Unfortunately, I'm listening to her again and again on all the videos I've got. But and then he encouraged it. Well, he taught her how to do, spiritual assessments, how to do healing assessments, which we can't do in England anymore now. And he really made it. He demanded absolutely perfection if he could get it. So he made her cry a lot. She loved him. He made her laugh a lot, but he made her cry a lot because she wanted to please him, like you do want to please your teacher, don't you? And they became the best of friends. Yes, and she demonstrated all over the country, but he was well known all over the country with him. But he was well known for ringing her up and saying, "Maybe so you're coming to watch me dem at such and such church tonight." And Mavis would say, "Yes, I am, Gordon." When she turned up at the church, he hadn't turned up. So, of course, they got Mavis up to them. And he was very good at doing that with people. So he put them on the spot, really, so that, they had, because all the audience were there waiting for Gordon. And suddenly Mavis had to be their second best.
Talk about imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah. So it was a challenge. So yes, he challenged her in many ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. But he did that to other mediums as well.
Yeah. That was part of his training plan, I think. Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah.
We'll throw you in the deep end, see if you swim.
Yeah.
And I know that she valued that relationship, as you said. It's
very much so. To the extent, and we talked about her dropping out for a little while, to the extent when she did eventually decide after this little hiatus and stepping away from mediumship, she rang him up and he just said, "I've been expecting this call." And she said, "Why?" He said, "I've just been stood on my doorstep sending thoughts to you for you to ring me." And he used to do things like that to her. And of course, she said, "Well, why didn't you ring me?" "No, it was for you to come forward to me." And he did all sorts of things like that to her. But also he used to, and again, one of the things that Mavis always said was when Gordon died, she thought she would know that he died, and she didn't. And it really upset her that. And her and Paul Jacobs were the only two that were allowed by the family to go and see him in the Chapel of Rest. And she was heartbroken. She was heartbroken. But neither her nor Paul have ever had any real evidence of this man back in any situation at all. They've had the teacher, the leader, the presenter, but they've never had the man that they knew that was funny, that would wear his slippers and his cardigan. And he always used to play "My Dearest Dear" for Mavis on the piano, and and that was their song together. And they never got that evidence.
Coziness, yeah.
And yet I'm delighted to say I'm getting the real Mavis me, with some of the evidence I'm getting. But they were always disappointed. She saw Gordon physically or objectively on many occasions after he died. and particularly when he wanted her to have an eye on a student and keep the student under her wing, you know. And then once in Australia, she'd been, when we first got together, Mavis was, you know, very much kind of fearful of me, because I used to say, oh, well, I'll get you these handouts for this, or I'll do this display, before computers came along. Now, and she did eventually get into PowerPoints with me, but she eventually got into it. And we were in Australia once, and I'd done this PowerPoint presentation for her. And where we went out for our break was on a balcony. We were in a missionary or somewhere, a convent or something. And it was like being in the Raj in India. So they've got all the china cups and saucers out for us. And on one afternoon when Mavis was sitting there on her own with a cup of tea and a cigarette, Gordon appeared to her and said, Mavis, you are teaching it in exactly the way I want you to now, which she was thrilled about, because he loved the theory, you know, and he loved the quality of the presentation. So, yeah, so she was thrilled with that.
And I think that was at a really pivotal time, because for you, you're just a born organizer. Like,
yeah. And that's been the joy. I mean, we never anticipated this. I mean, I met Mavis in 1983, long before we got together, because I had a sitting with her. But that's another 3-hour story. And from then on, we became friends, which is why ultimately in 1999 we did get together. But yeah, I've been a teacher all my life, and I'm a creator and an organizer and so on. So, but when we got together, I was a head teacher in a school, so I was still busy. And so I just used to kind of run Mavis to places when I could, but she was going down to the college and so on and so forth. Not traveling abroad quite as much as we ultimately did, but sometimes to Norway or to Finland and other places like that. And then, of course, I eventually started to introduce my teaching ideas, and she rallied against it all the time. And of course, I didn't impose it. And sometimes if I did produce things, she never used them anyway. So I got used to that ultimately.
But silent defiance.
Yeah. but again, that fear of, you know, teaching. And yet she was the most wonderful teacher. And eventually, when I, you know, retired, and we were working together, it just became this lovely combination. Because the one thing she said about me was, I never wanted to be her. And other people that she'd met, including to a certain degree her husband, always aspired to become the medium that she was. And I'd never any aspiration to do that. I loved what she did. I was very proud of her. I never tired of listening to her at all. But I could add my, you know, creative and organizational skills to it, and promotional skills, because, you know, I got Mavis out there in the bigger world, if you like, where she deserved to be. And so it was just a fantastic combination for us both, and a joy for us both. So certainly for the last 15 years together, we were never apart for a minute. You know, we traveled the world together. We lived an ordinary life at home together. We went to the theatre. We loved musical theatre. We wined and dined and socialised with friends, and created lots of mentorship programs and teaching programs. So it was just perfect.
Yes, it was a marriage of ideas as well.
Absolutely.
I think you're right that she didn't want you as a competition of trying to tell her whether her mediumship was right or her teaching was right, but just to be in that supportive role.
Absolutely.
Amplifying and magnifying. And I'll never forget when you were here in Lilydale, and Mavis had done a wonderful lecture for the mediums, and I was doing I was filming episodes with Janet Nahavik, and then I had Mavis coming in to the house to do that. And you arrived, and I thought you'd go sit in the living room or something. You were like, no, I'm going to sit right here. And you asked for scraps of paper, and I was like, what's going on? Because I thought, I'm going to be interviewing Mavis, right? Well, it turns out that there you are, and like as Mavis is talking, you would just sort of write a little note to her. There's passing of notes that would go on.
Do you know what? It's so interesting that, Willa, because
Yeah.
now I'm editing all the films of, that I've filmed, or even some of the Zoom sessions. And Mavis is doing a webinar, and then all of a sudden she'll look down, and I know what I've done. I've passed her a note.
So there's this there's this symbiotic relationship experience that's going on, and she just sort of incorporates it,
Absolutely.
and and yet it's not like you were necessarily trying to take it over. You were supplementing.
Yeah, just a prompt, really, because that's what Mavis used to say, kind of, because she could meander.
Yes.
And I suppose because I was an English teacher amongst everything else, so the structure and the organisation, and eventually she used to say when she was doing inspirations or philosophies in churches, did I wander off? Because she could do, as we all can, can't we? I do it all the time, and she used to say, "Well, you do it," and I do.
Tangents happen,
and so sometimes it was just keeping on track, but I didn't have to tell her anything because it was all in Mavis, wasn't it? So it might be, take this angle or so. I don't know. I can't remember, but I don't remember that at yours.
and I thought, well, this is, I think it's really amazing because some mediums would be like, I wish I had somebody like Jean who would do all this stuff.
I've actually got a recording of Mavis in an interview with a lady called Kath Shirley, who was the president of Longton Spiritualist Church, which was Gordon's church. And she actually says, everybody needs a Jeannie.
Yeah, we almost want to call you, you magically just make it happen, right?
Yeah.
And
I loved it, you see, those are the, and even now, I mean, obviously we're laughing about Mavis. Obviously the physical loss is enormous. But I've got her still working with me. I know that.
Yes.
But
isn't it a role reversal? Because now she prompts you.
Absolutely.
Right. So there's this a bit of the here, I'll slide you a note.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true. Those drop-ins have come through mediums to me to kind of advise me where to go and what to do,
and how best to proceed,
and
all of that. And I think in the dynamic of your particular help of her mediumship business, and knowing that she could have someone that understood her and travel with and be able to have the downtime with, but work with. A lot of people wouldn't be able to work with their partners.
No, absolutely.
Would not be able to have.
Sorry, darling. Two expressions that we had, which was one, Mavis talked to the dead and I talked to the living. And the second one was, Mavis doesn't know how she gets anywhere. She just turns up because she didn't have to do anything because I'd done it all, And that was wonderful. So it worked for us both.
Right. Because and it's good, you didn't have this resentment of having to do it. You just did it.
And I love doing it, and I'd been successful in my own career and I didn't need anything else. And Mavis always used to say I was too black and white to really let mediumship happen with me because I wanted to dot my I's and cross my T's. Having said that, I'm desperately trying to not be that now because I really want my own communication with her. I haven't got it yet. I know when she's here. I can feel when she's here. But I'd love to have that real communication.
And to relax into that.
Yeah. But I'm getting it through many other mediums.
That's beautiful. Well, any last stories that you'd like to share about Mavis that you think would be great for people to know?
Well, there are so many really, but I think the one thing that one of her other wonderful expressions was, it's no good being so heavenly that you know earthly use. And that was the joy of Mavis, because she was ordinary, she was down to earth. But on the other side, she was so reverent and inspirational. So she had both sides to her, and you know, if anybody was disparaging or discouraging or I'm trying to think of the right word, or disrespectful of mediumship and the ability to link with people that have gone before us, and the understanding that this God source, the Great Spirit, the universal intelligence, if anybody was disrespectful of that, she would be so upset and annoyed. And yet, on the other hand, she balanced that with being the ordinary Mavis that liked a cigarette, loved a gin and tonic. Only the odd one. I don't want to make her sound like a drinker. She wasn't, but you know, she was ordinary, and the one thing that she loved more than anything else, apart from a mediumship, was cleaning. Because she loved cleaning, she loved washing and ironing. She used to talk to Mika-san more when she was ironing than in any other stage. She never sat for meditation or in the quiet. Before a demonstration, it wasn't sitting quietly. It was playing Rhinestone Cowboy or something where she could sing and dance, you know. So she had that lovely balance of everything, really.
Right.
And
so no sitting in the power for her.
No, not
There's only dancing into the power.
I'm not saying she didn't do it in her early days. She probably did. She could never sit in meditation. She used to say she was thrown out of so many meditation circles because she couldn't go on these journeys that they all went on. She wanted to be doing something, and because she was always busy, maybe. So, but you know, latterly she just switched the power on. She said, "I'd sit down as Mavis Pittilla, the ordinary Mavis Pittilla, and then stand up as the medium." Switch the power on, and goodness gracious, when she was in that power, there was nobody better, you know.
And you know, she was able to also release from any physical pain too.
Absolutely, yeah. For the last 12 years, her health was terrible, really, because she got osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis. She'd had a kidney removed. She'd had all sorts going on. It never got her down. She just went on, you know, and would never refuse to do work or go anywhere. But in those times when she was demonstrating or speaking, she was relieved of that pain because she was in the power. So Mavis's belief in the power was very important. So
was that tricky for you as her partner, as her wife, to say, maybe you're pushing it a little much?
No.
Or did you always just say, I know you want to do this, I'll support you in this regardless?
I didn't have any choice.
So you couldn't turn into the nag and say, no, Mavis, don't do that.
No, she loved it too much. So on the odd occasion, she kind of did step aside from a few things, but it was very rare. Very rare. And she, you know, to 2 weeks, I'm just looking at the side of me here because her chair's there. I mustn't get upset. But 2 weeks before she died, she was still teaching. I couldn't put her on the camera like this because she wasn't good. Right. But I was talking to the students, and she was telling them what they should be doing and prompting me, and you know, ask them about this, and that was 2 weeks before she died, you know. So so there's no doubt she's carrying on from the other world. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's wonderful that you're carrying on the legacy of Mavis, and that it's something that you know is deeply needed still. Her understandings and her philosophies, and bringing that to light, and that you are directing that in a beautiful way. And you have a whole bunch of students that have been trained by Mavis, and
we did a 3-year teaching program. And I must admit, when I developed it, Mavis said to one of our friends, "What's she doing that for?" And it wasn't really out. Some of the students had asked me, would I help them become teachers? So I thought, well, what better way than to train them Mavis's ways and utilize all knowledge and her skills and her philosophy. So I developed this Mavis Pittilla teacher training program. And I'd wheel Mavis in, not literally, but say, Mavis, come and talk to them about this. And then I'd give them tasks to do. But we did that for about 3 years. And sadly, just before they were about to graduate, she died. So we did that afterwards. So, and then I was asked to do a program for a company. And because I'd got these 15 teachers already trained. So I present Mavis's teachings through her videos, not me presenting them. I kind of am the compere, if you like, and then I present Mavis's teachings. And then the teachers teach the mechanics of the mediumship in very small circles. And it's worked wonderfully. And now, you know, it's just opened Mavis up to another audience that had never even heard of her, you know, which is wonderful.
You know, if someone was interested in watching some Mavis videos, I do have the archive videos of past shows that I've done with Mavis.
Oh, fantastic.
We've done, you know, the miracle of mediumship, Between Two Worlds, mediumship, A Pearl of Great Price. Those are great things if people want to look back in the archive videos. Are there videos accessible through either mavispittilla.com or some other site?
Yes.
If people were just wanting to get a little bit more Mavis flavor.
Absolutely. There's a range of videos on the website that you can have access to. There's obviously some on YouTube and various other places. And at the moment, I've filmed her for years, but I never even, I just did it because I never even thought about it. And because even, age is happening and illness is happening, but you never think of life ending. It's one of the strange things about being a human, isn't it? You go on till the last minute. And because I was asked to do this program, I've brought all the films together and I'm, editing them now and archiving them and using them. But because Mavis and I had this curriculum about the whole medium, which covered all aspects, I'm now bringing these videos together within that curriculum. So it's an absolutely wonderful teaching program. And it's Mavis still there, vibrant and alive, and it's gorgeous. Yeah.
Oh, that's so lovely. Well, we really appreciate you coming on the show today and sharing about Mavis and giving us a behind the scenes tour, if you will, into her life and what it was like to partner with her and assist her in these endeavors. And I'm glad that Mavis still has her finger on the pulse, so to speak.
He absolutely does. And there was no greater joy for me, and still is no greater joy. And I've just got to say, Willa, she loved you.
Thank you, Jean. I appreciate that. I loved her too, and I can feel her supporting me in my work too.
Oh, I'm sure she will. I'm absolutely sure she will. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jean, for being our guest today. And I know people will probably replay this video and enjoy that beautiful, lovely Mavis and that heart, that humble heart, and that purity of spirit that she will always exemplify. And what a stunning example of spiritualism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, darling.
Thank you
for the honor of allowing me to talk about it, because again, that's my greatest joy too. So.
Yeah, and certainly came through. So thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. We really appreciate all of your beautiful comments. Please let us know that you like this video, like, share, subscribe, and all of those good things so that we can keep bringing more wonderful videos to you and educating you about spiritualism, mediumship, healing, faith, family, and more. All right. Goodbye, everyone. See you next week.